Hey everyone, I apologize in advance for any issue with my English, and if you have any trouble with understanding what I'm saying, feel free to turn on the subtitles that I've included in this tutorial. And today I want to show you how I created this crystal using Blender Geometry Nodes system. So let's dive into a new Blender file and get our workspace set up. So I opened new Blender file and I'm go to Geometry Nodes tab and make the node space a little bit bigger. And I'm gonna use my default cube for creating Blender Geometry Node system. And I'm gonna start with base shape, which will be made of a curve line. So I'm gonna search for curve line node. Now I'm gonna change my dimensions to 10 meters. 10 meters. I want to add profile to my line, so I'm gonna use a curve to mesh node. And I need a profile curve, so I'm gonna just use a circle, curve circle, no sample curve, curve circle. I'm gonna check fill caps and reduce resolution from 32 to something more like 4 or maybe 5. Okay, this is my base geometry for crystal, and now I want to create the top part. So first I'm gonna put a frame on it and call it maybe base. Okay, so now we create the base shape. We need to create the boolean object so I can create top part of my crystal. So I'm gonna use ecosphere for that. I'm gonna use node instance on points, and as instance I'm gonna use my ecosphere, and as points my curve line. Now when I preview it, I have two ecospheres, but I want only the top one, so I'm gonna just use endpoint selection node, connect it to selection, and set start size to 0. Now I have only ecosphere on top of my curve. So now when I make it longer or shorter, the ecosphere will always remain on top of that. Now I'm gonna add transform node after ecosphere, and thanks to that I can easily rotate it here and change scale. And I want it as input for my group, so I'm gonna grab this group input and connect rotation and scale to that. I also want to realize these instances. Okay, now I'm gonna use mesh boolean node. And set it to intersect. And as you can see, I have something like that, but when we change the scale of the crystal and actually invert this, because I want this to be top, not the bottom, I have something more like crystal. And with this control I can easily change how the top part looks like. I can, for example, make it more pointy or less pointy. I can rotate it so it will look little bit different. But to actually better see that shape, I'm gonna change the smooth method, because it's currently set on shade smooth, but when I set it to shade flat, it looks much more like a crystal. So now I can play with that and choose the shape that I like. But there is one problem, because if I want to make it more pointy, so make Z much bigger, I can jump to problem where my boolean is not working anymore. And this is going because my crystal object is inside of the ecosphere. When I use the join node and connect my ecosphere and my base mesh, as you can see, the boolean is bigger than my base objects, so the intersection doesn't do anything. Okay, so how can I fix this problem? The problem is that my ecosphere is currently higher than the base mesh. So I want the top part of the ecosphere always remain at maximum height on this line. So I want situation more like that the intersection always will be happening. So the best ways to do this is use node called attribute statistic. So first I'm gonna use that node, attribute statistics, and I'm gonna plug realize instances into it. As you can see, this node doesn't have any geometry output, only numbers. But to use it, I need to plug something in attribute. So I make statistics of something. I want to know the maximum height of that ecosphere. So I'm gonna use position node. And I want to only know the z height. So I'm gonna use separate x, y, and z. And plug it into attribute. And now I can know the maximum height of my ecosphere, which would be that height. Okay. Now I want to set, I want to set the top of this curve line, which would be this point, to the height of maximum height of the ecosphere. I can just use set position node for that. Okay, I'm gonna delete this joint geometry and make a little order here. Okay, this would be my base ecosphere. And now I'm gonna plug the maximum height into position, but first I need to create the vector, because this is only one number, the z-axis, and I also want the x and y. And to do that, I can just use combine x, y, z, plug it into position. Now I have only point because all the positions are set to 0, but when I use position node and separate x, y, z, I can combine them back, plug x to x and y to y, and for z I can use the maximum. Okay, so now I'm only seeing one point, because I set the same z position to two endpoints of the curve, and I only want to set to the top one, which would be that point. but as you can remember, we already did it using endpoint selection, so I can use it here too. I can use endpoint selection node and plug it into selection, and this selection, yeah. And now, as you can see, when I use join node and plug our curve line and our ecosphere, the top of the line is on the maximum height of our ecosphere, which is exactly what we wanted. So now, when I'm gonna use mesh boolean, and I'm gonna first rotate something, and now when I'm gonna scale it on the z-axis, the intersection will be always happening, no matter how high I go. Okay, so let's create some more crystal-like shape. And now I have the problem because I can't actually set the height of the crystal without deformation the top. So it would be nice to have some way to select only the top part and move it top and down. So we can do this, but first let's make a little cleanup. So this is our base mesh. And this is our base ecosphere. And here we have our statistic to correct position. So let's maybe call it correct position. Oh, let's save the file. Okay, back to the process. I want to vary the height of the crystal. And to do this, I'm gonna use a normal property of our crystal shape, because now all the normals from the sides are pointing in this way or this way or this way. The bottom one are pointing on the down, but the top one are always pointing a little bit up, so I can use it to separate them. And to better see what I'm doing, I can use a recent new Blender feature that allows me preview attributes. So first I'm gonna use the normal node. I can with Ctrl Shift plug the normal and say shade smooth node, and this is the visual representation of the normal. And to better use it, I can use node that is called dot product. It's vector math node set to dot product. And now when I connect it, it's all black. But when I select the direction here, as you can see, I separate all the faces that are pointing up, which is exactly what we wanted. Okay, so I'm gonna delete the viewer node, and now I'm gonna add set position node, and plug for selection, not dot product, large product. But as you can see, this is the pink output and this is the gray output, and it is working. But for the sake of colors, outputs and input, we can use the less than node, and it's still maybe not less than, but greater than. Oh, as you can see, we have better control what is actually selected. Okay, let's reset that. Oh, and now it's working perfectly. Okay. So as you can see, now I can modify the shape of our crystal with this control, how pointy it is, the different variation of rotation, even the scale. And after that I can just set the height of the crystal using the set position node. So it would be nice to have also input for that. So we can create an input node, and then we can combine X, Y and Z node and plug it here, and plug it for the Z input, and now we have the control of the height of the crystal. Pretty cool. Okay, so this is all the nodes for our base crystal. We can now make a little bit clean up here. Okay, so this is gonna be set position, actually set the height, and this is gonna be boolean. And all of these nodes, you can select it all without output and join it, and I will call it base crystal. Okay, now this font is a little bit small, so under the in panel, inside node and under properties, I can make it bigger, and also I can change the color of it. Maybe something like little dark orange, something like that. Okay. So this is the first part of the tutorial, create the base crystal, and now we're gonna focus on creating edge imperfections, because when I zoom in, all the edges are perfectly straight lines, and I want to create little imperfections. So to do this, we're going to do something like that. First, I'm gonna separate only the edges of this mesh, and after that I'm gonna scatter on them some points, and on each of these points I'm gonna put the instance. It would be ecosphere probably. Then I randomize the rotation scale of this ecosphere, and then boolean it from the crystal mesh. So thanks to that I have little imperfections of all at the edges. Okay, so to do it we start with converting the mesh to curve, because this is the easiest way to actually delete all faces and have only edges. And also I want to add the profile to this lines, because that will allow me scatter point that are closer to the surface and a little bit further of the surface. It will be looking more randomized. So I'm gonna use curve circle, and then mesh curve to mesh. As you can see, it's a little too big, so I'm gonna use something like 0.04. Okay, and now I can scatter points on that. So I'm gonna use the distribute point on faces. As you can see, I now have points on the edges of my crystals. And now I can just put instances on them. And for the instances, I can use ecosphere. Maybe a little too big. Perfect. No, they're the same. I'm just checking if we can somehow even less vertices, but it is pretty low, so it's gonna be fast boolean. Now I can maybe set shade smooth for this ecospheres, so it'll be looking more smooth. And after that I can just use mesh boolean. And now I'm gonna plug it actually to the second socket, and for this first socket I'm gonna use just my mesh. As you can see, I now have imperfections on the edges, but I want to put more focus into them to make it look better. Okay, so things I want to do right now would be just randomizing rotation and scale of these imperfections. So let's make a little bit of order here. Join it, and let's call it maybe mesh outline. And this part would be instances on points. And now for the randomized rotation scale, we'll be start by using noise textures. So I'm gonna create noise texture. It will be 4D because I want to randomize it and create the global seed variable. Actually, we can create it now. So I'm gonna create the input and plug input to W, and I'm gonna rename W under N panel in group part. I'm gonna rename it from W to seed. I'm also gonna change the float type to integer. Okay. I'm gonna duplicate it by using shortcut Shift Ctrl D. It remain my connections, and maybe I can just add to it some number because I want this texture be different from this texture. Okay, let's plug maybe the color output to rotation and the color output from here to scale. Now I'm just gonna preview only the instances. I want to have a little more control of the rotation, so I'm gonna add a vector math node and set it to multiply. And I'm gonna put just big number here, so I'm sure that the rotations are randomized across all of it. And from the noise texture for scale, I want to have more control. So actually I'm gonna use the map range node. So now I can map the range from the smaller scale for the biggest scale. So I don't want the minimal scale to be 0 because I don't want the particles to disappear. So I'm just setting something small, and the biggest part can be maybe a little bit bigger, something like that. So now I'm gonna preview it by boolean. And as you can see, I don't like I quite don't like that this isn't on edge. So I'm gonna reduce the radius of it to maybe 0.25, 0 to 5. Okay, and now as you can see, I have these points exactly on the edges, but still with a little more random factor that they are not exactly on the edge, but a little bit more right, for example. So I can increase the density of it, have a little bit more of them, or maybe a little less. So this is how this looks like now. I'm pretty happy with results, and I'm gonna clean it up a little and join it, and I call it random noise. As I create this seed variable, I can also hide other inputs by using Ctrl H and duplicate it, and I want to take it out from this frame, so I can just use Alt P shortcut, and I put it here and connect seed to seed. Now when I change the seed, as you can see, I have completely different results with each seed, which is exactly what I wanted. Okay, so this is the second part of our crystal mesh. I'm gonna join it and rename it to edge imperfections. I'm gonna make the label a little bit bigger and the color maybe more yellow one. Okay, so this is our edge imperfections mesh, but now I want to create some more geometry inside of crystal. It will be called inclusions, and inclusions is something that you can find inside of the crystals. It's something like imperfections, which light will be bouncing inside of the crystal to create more realistic results. So to do this, I'm gonna distribute some points inside of the mesh. So I'm not gonna actually use this one because this is much more complicated. But I want to use this mesh, which is more simple, and it will be calculating a little bit faster. Actually, we can see how much faster. So I'm gonna use first mesh to volume node, and between it I'm gonna actually use transform node. I'm gonna set the scale to something a little bit smaller, but actually maybe not transform node, but scale elements. Yeah, this will gonna do better. Okay, I'm gonna scale this element because I don't want the interior elements to be too close to the faces of crystal. So to compare the time, how fast the node will be executed, I can just in node editor overlays turn on timing. And as you can see, now I convert my mesh to volume, and it takes 13 milliseconds. But if I'm gonna use this as input, it's gonna take 21 milliseconds, which is not a big difference, but I don't need to waste this 6 milliseconds. So I'm gonna just plug it here. Okay, so now I want to scatter some points inside this volume, and the easiest way to do this is just to use distribute points in volume. As you can see, I have now a few points inside of my volume. I'm gonna move it a little bit down. And this also has seed parameter, so I'm gonna create group input and connect seed to seed. Now I want to create some instances on this point because I want the real geometry for inclusions. So I'm connecting instance on points and ecosphere for instances. I want to make it a little bit smaller, so I'm gonna reduce the radius. But now all the instances looks exactly the same, and I want to change it. So I'm gonna use realize node, realize instances, and now I'm able to interact with each of this particle as it will be real geometry. So when I plug set position node, and I'm gonna use also noise texture and plug it to the offset, as you can see each of ecosphere is different, but when I mute this node, as you can see, the only things that change is position of that, which is not what I wanted. Okay, so after realizing instances, we can randomize the size of it by using noise texture. And I want to set it to 40, and I'm gonna use W input as seed. And then I'm gonna use normal node to scale the mesh along normals with vector scale node. Now when I play to offset, I just want a little bit more control over it, so I'm gonna use multiplied node here. I'm gonna use the subdivision level of 2. After randomizing the first part, which is randomizing the scale, I want to more randomize the shape of it. So I'm gonna use the second set position node. And here I'm gonna duplicate the noise part. Maybe add math node between to have different pattern. And here I'm gonna map range this noise to have better control of shape. And then I'm gonna add this to position to randomize position of each vertices. I'm gonna plug it not to offset but for position. As you can see, this is too heavy, so I'm gonna just use multiply vector math multiplied node here, and now I have control over it. As you can see, all of the particles are heading toward this direction, and we can change it by using map range node set up to minus 0.5 and 0.5. Now as you can see, there is no one direction where all elements are heading up. And why is this like that? Because the noise texture return only positive values, so all the elements I'm gonna move toward the positive axis, which would be positive x, positive y, and positive z. But I also want them to move on the negative axis, so when I'm gonna map range from 0 to 1 to minus half and plus half, it's gonna be better arranged. Okay, I think this effect is a little bit too strong, so maybe we can multiply it by something around 0.5. And now I'm gonna want to scale all of these elements once again, so I'm gonna use scale elements to reduce the scale a little. And this is it. This is our inclusions. We can make a little bit more of them using more density. No, this node in distribute points. Yeah, here we can use more density. And let's make a little bit of order here. So this is my part for randomized shape. This part will be for distribute points in mesh. And this part will be for randomize scale. And after all, maybe we can smooth it a little with saturate smooth. I'm also gonna use some inputs, so I create group input and plug the scale. Also, I think it might be important to plug the density. Okay, now I have more control here with density factor and scale. So to connect two parts of our crystal, I'm gonna just use the join geometry nodes to connect the boolean part with our inclusions. So as you can see, maybe I make it a little bit bigger. Okay. So this is before it for our geometry nodes in the first part of the tutorial. And to better show you how it looks currently, I'm gonna quickly create the new material. We called it crystal. And I'm gonna jump to shading editor and change the render to cycles, GPU, denoise, and I'm gonna turn on the scene lights. Okay, and for the shader I'm just for now use the glass material. And why it isn't here? And this is because we didn't apply it inside our geometry network. So back to geometry nodes, I can use set material node, and here I can just choose not material but crystal. So back in shading, these are current results, which is not the best, but we'll work it out a little bit more. We can make it a little bit more rough. And also we can turn off the background to focus more on the crystal. In the film we can turn off the transparent. Okay, these are current results. Okay, I want to compare it to the final one, so I'm gonna just quick jump to my asset browser with node geometry nodes, crystals, and this single mountain giant crystal. Okay, so this is the final one that we are heading to, and these are current results. As you can see, the shader do a job here. And also we have one more layer of elements in geometry nodes, which will be this fracture part. But this will be in the next tutorial. But if you want to check it out already, you can just download it from description, link in the description, the final result. And if you are interested in more of the procedural geometry nodes crystal system, you can check out my geometry node assets packs called Nodey. So thanks for watching and see you in the next part.